Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students of 8C, Assalamu alaikum. I am your teacher Muhammad Ilyas, and this is our fourth introduction for biology for Cambridge. Dear students, today's our topic is the circle of life, the chapter number 21 from your book NLS Science 2, page number 253 to 266. Today's objectives are as follows. We will try to understand the concept of the food chain, food web, and the energy transfer in the food chain. Secondly, we will focus on the food pyramids, its types, and the importance of the decomposers. Thirdly, we will discuss the role of carbon-nitrogen cycles in balancing the ecosystem. Start from the food chain. Food chain is an example of the food relationship among organisms in an ecosystem. The food relationship among organisms is called a food chain, and every plant and animal in a food chain is called a link. Food chain starts from the food producers. These are the green plants, and green plants are called food producers because they can make their own food. They provide food for the rest of the organisms in the food chain. Animals get their food by eating plants or other animals. Because they cannot make their own food, they are called consumers. A herbivore is a primary consumer because it directly feeds on the plants. And the animals that feeds on the primary consumers, they are called secondary consumers. A carnivore is a secondary consumer, as you can see from this diagram. Dear students, now we are going to focus on the food web. If we trace every food chain in an ecosystem, we will end up with a lot of interconnected food chains. This is because many animals eat more than one type of food, and this results in the formation of a network of interconnected food chains, which is called a food web. Dear students, most of the food chains in the sea start with the plant plankton, which are microscopic plants that live in the surface water, where there is plenty of sunlight. The plant planktons use sunlight from the sun to make their own food by photosynthesis, and they are eaten by the tiny animals in the water called animal plankton. Small fish and animals such as shrimp, crabs, and whales eat plankton. The bigger fish eat the small fish. Seabirds and sea mammals feed on a variety of fish. Most food webs are hung delicately in their balance. This is because any change at just one link in a food chain can upset the balance of the entire food web. Now, we are going to discuss the transfer of energy in the food chain. A food chain shows how energy is transferred from one form of food to another form. For example, when an animal eats a plant, some of the plant will be digested and absorbed into its body. Some will not be digested and will be passed out of its body as feces. Not all the digested plant will be converted into chemical energy stored in the animal's body. Some will be converted into heat, which will be lost into the surroundings. Some will be converted into other forms of energy, which will be used for the animal's activity. This total amount of energy that ends up being stored in the animal's body will be much less than the total chemical energy that was originally stored in the plant. So we can say at every link in a food chain, energy is lost to the surroundings as heat and other forms of energy. The amount of energy reaching to the end of the food chain is only a small fraction of the amount of energy at the beginning. In other words, the amount of energy transferred decreases along a food chain, and as I told you earlier, many food chains interlinked with each other and form a food web. So now we are going to focus on the food pyramids. If we are able to count the number of leaves, caterpillars and the birds in in their habitat, you will find that the number of leaves is much higher than the number of caterpillars, which is higher than the number of birds, and the number of different links in a food chain can be shown using a food pyramids of numbers. As you can see from this diagram, the number of organisms decreases along a food chain, and this is because the amount of energy transfer decreases along a food chain. As you can see from this diagram, the number of leaves are much higher than the number of caterpillars, and then the birds, and then the hawk. The pyramid of numbers for some food chains has an odd shape because the primary consumers are much larger in number than the producers. The pyramid of numbers often does not give an accurate picture of how much food is eaten at each level of the food chain. To obtain more accurate information about a food chain, a pyramid of biomass is more useful instead of the numbers. Biomass is the mass of living matter. A pyramid of biomass shows the mass of living matter at each level of the food. At each level of the food chain, and the area of each box in the pyramid of biomass represent the amount of biomass of each link in the food chain. So this is about the pyramids. Now we are focusing on the decomposers. Dear students, life in an ecosystem does not end when plants and animals die. In fact, the food chain continues with the remains of the dead plants and animals serving as a food for one another. Important class of organisms living in the same ecosystems, and they are called the decomposers. Like scavengers, fungi and bacteria are some examples of the decomposers. Scavengers feed on the dead plants and animals and break them down into smaller fragments. Vultures, hyenas, cows, earthworms. These are the few examples of the scavengers. These decomposers release the nutrients trapped in the bodies of the dead organisms so that these nutrients can be recycled. Now we are going to focus on the carbon cycle. All living organisms contain the element carbon. Carbon makes up the carbohydrates, proteins and fats in tissues of living things. In our ecosystem, carbon in the form of carbon dioxide circulates from the environment into the bodies of the living organisms and then back to the environment again. And this circulation of carbon is known as carbon cycle, as you can see from this diagram. Plants use carbon dioxide from the air when they do photosynthesis. They convert the carbon atoms into in the gaseous carbon dioxide into sugars and starch, which are carbohydrates. In the daytime, plants take in the carbon dioxide from air. At the night time, they give out the carbon dioxide as well. When animals and decomposers respires carbon dioxide, a waste product of respiration is released from their food in the air. Some decomposers cause partial decay of the organic matter of the dead bodies of plants and animals and the tiny sea creatures, which forms fossil fuels. When fossil fuels or other organic fuels burn, the carbon or carbon compounds in them react with the oxygen to produce a huge amount of carbon dioxide. Motor vehicles, for example, run on petrol and emit a lot of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, and this carbon dioxide again used by the plants to make the carbohydrates and other compounds of the living organisms. In this how the carbon circulate from atmosphere into the living organisms and from living organisms into the atmosphere. Now we are going to focus on the nitrogen cycle. Dear students, about 78% of the air is nitrogen. All living organisms need nitrogen to make proteins, which are used for building the cells in our body. Animals and most of plants cannot use the nitrogen directly from the atmosphere because it is not absorbable from the animals and plants as well. Most animals, the nitrogen they breathe in from the air goes into the body, travels around it, and it is breathed out again. It is not being consumed in the body. However, animals obtain nitrogen to make proteins from the plants. The circulation of nitrogen and its compounds in the environment is called nitrogen cycle. Plants and animals can only use nitrogen that has been fixed or changed into a more reactive form. The plants can use compounds of nitrogen such as nitrates or ammonium salts. Nitrates and ammonium salts are highly soluble in water and can be easily absorbed into the plant through its roots. Animals obtain nitrogen in the form of compounds such as proteins by eating plants and other animals that feed on the plants. In this way, nitrogen passes along the food chain. There are several ways in which nitrogen gas in the air is converted into nitrates or ammonium salts. There are nitrogen fixing bacteria that causes the nitrogen gas in the soil or in the air to combine chemically with the hydrogen, oxygen and other elements to produce ammonium salts or nitrates. They can live freely in the soil or in the root nodules of the leguminous plants such as peas, beans and clover. Lightning combines nitrogen with oxygen in the air to form oxides of nitrogen, and these oxides dissolve in the rainwater which falls to the ground, and these oxides of the nitrogen then combine with other substances to form nitrates. Nitrogen and hydrogen can be chemically combined to form ammonia, and this is known as Haber process. Ammonia is then used to make fertilizers which farmers and the gardeners add to the soil to promote the growth of the plants. So in this way, the nitrogen in the air can be converted into nitrates and ammonia, which is very useful for the plants. And plants use them and make the proteins in their body, and this protein is eaten by the animals which directly feed on the plants, and then the animals which eats other animals. In this way, these nitrogenous compounds transferred from plants to other animals, and then the decomposers plays their role and break down these complex organic compounds and release the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. In this way, the cycle of the nitrogen completes, and in this way, by the completion of the nitrogen and carbon cycles, the balancing of the ecosystem is maintained. Otherwise, if these cycles disturb, the ecosystem will be disturbed, because as I discussed with you, the carbon and the nitrogen both are very essential for making different biochemicals which are present in the bodies of the plants and other animals. So my dear students, these cycles are very much important for balancing the ecosystem. Hope you have understand this chapter. Now I have selected some review questions, question number 2 and 7 from your chapter number 21, and this is on the page number 266. Please do these questions and send to your respective groups. Thank you very much for being with me. Stay home, stay safe. Allah Hafiz.